This presentation is about Rigoberta Menchu by Griffith, Ryan, Malin, and Eric. This is Eric Taveras, and I'll be talking to the backgrounds and context. Rigoberta was originally from Chime, Guatemala. Her father was Vincent Menchu, a human rights activist that fought for the rights of indigenous Guatemalan people. She received a Nobel Prize in 1992 for her efforts against the injustice of indigenous Guatemalan. Rigoberta used the prize money from her Nobel Prize to create the Tom Foundation, to support and help Mayan communities from the genocide that has happened in Guatemala. She gained immense international popularity after releasing her book I, Rigoberta Menchu, that was translated to many different languages including English, Spanish, French, and German. This is Eric Taveras, and I'm continuing the background and context. Rigoberta also ran for President of Guatemala twice, once in 2007, another in 2011. Both bids were very unsuccessful. In 2013, she helped in the trials against former dictator Efrain Rios Montt, who after a lengthy trial was sentenced to over 80 years in prison for the war crimes he has committed against many indigenous people of Guatemala. He's a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador since June 21st, 1996.
I'm Griffin. I did the risks in Guatemala. Rigoberta Menchu lived in a life of fear and passion that allowed her to help build a better Guatemala. She grew up as a peasant farmer, leading to an uneasy lifestyle that brings struggle and danger. These dangers brought upon her and her family are the reason for her Nobel Peace Prize today and the success in fighting for human rights. For most Guatemalan natives, their lives were lived on large plantations, picking cotton or coffee beans. This poor lifestyle also brought along harsh conditions that she was forced to face. The owners of the plantations used pesticides in order to kill insects that would harm the crop, but were unaware of its harms to humans or chose not to do anything about it. Although Rigoberta was not affected by this poison, her brother was less fortunate and died due to these harmful chemicals. However, pesticides were not the only factor in the poor working conditions. All workers were subject to a poor diet and being overworked, which led to another one of her brothers dying due to malnutrition. Rigoberta was born into a time of violence and death that was caused by the military dictatorship. Because of her beliefs in human rights and goals of peace, a target was printed on her back. This was around the time when a small group started a guerrilla movement that used quick surprise attacks to harass and overthrow groups of power. This led to their military leaders arresting and killing anyone who was involved or was suspected of being involved. As someone who supports human rights, Rigoberta was seen as someone who was opposed to the current power in Guatemala and could be another victim to the dictatorship. Her family was not fortunate enough to escape the violence. The Menchu family was accused of being associated with this rebellious group. Rigoberta's family was tortured, killed, and even raped because of their native background and need for a better Guatemala. Although her family was not lucky enough to escape the murderous military, she managed to go into hiding in Guatemala to later flee into Mexico, which allowed her to start a new chapter in her life.
This is Ryan Levesque, and I'll be drawing on Palmer in reference to Rigoberta Menchu's Rosa Parks moment. By the time Rigoberta Menchu was born, her country had already experienced 4.5 centuries of oppression. Combined with the ruling of the conquistadors and a succession of authoritarian and military leaders, the indigenous of Guatemala have experienced constant struggle since the 1500s. Their only glimpse of democracy was in the 1950s, but was soon overthrown and replaced with a military dictatorship. It was within this brutal form of government that Rigoberta Menchu would be born and raised under. A year after she was born, civil war had broke out between the government and Guatemalan rebel groups. She was raised by her parents to be deeply spiritual, and they instilled within her a profound sense of connection to her land and her people. The indigenous of Guatemala are deeply connected to their Mayan ancestors and have always been passionate about establishing a future for themselves. Even amongst the continuous threat of danger from government forces, the indigenous have constantly found the strength to organize and protest for basic freedoms and land rights. Stemming as far back as the conquistadors, there has always been a significant wealth gap between the people in power and the poor indigenous. Without any land to farm of their own, the indigenous people were forced to leave home and work for Guatemala's largest landowners. Although these imbalances persisted through the 20th century, the indigenous themselves have used their shared experience of struggle to unite and develop a strong sense of community. Even as the Civil War intensified, and the government continuously killed civilians and stripped away voting and land rights, the indigenous persisted through this cruelty and pushed towards freedom. This is Ryan Levesque continuing on with Rigoberta Menchu's Rosa Parks moment. During the late 1970s, the Civil War spread from the cities of Guatemala to the rural areas and highlands. This made life increasingly dangerous for the indigenous populations that lived here, and especially so for Rigoberta's father, whose role in fighting for indigenous land rights had led to continuous persecution. As a result of the increasing danger to indigenous people, Rigoberta's brother was among those who were kidnapped and murdered. Within the next year, she would lose both of her parents at the hands of government forces. Unfortunately, things would only get worse. In 1981, Guatemalan President Efrain Rios Montt led a genocidal campaign against the indigenous people of the highland areas. Life became increasingly dangerous for Rigoberta, and she would eventually flee from her country with help from the Sacred Family, a convent of nuns who she had worked for when she was younger. It was in Mexico where she would finally find safety in the company of a Roman Catholic group. It was among these religious people that she first met Bishop Samuel Ruiz. It was through their relationship that he was able to help Rigoberta alleviate the trauma she had accumulated while in Guatemala. The medicine she was given as part of her treatment allowed her to sleep for 15 days, the most rest she had gotten in her entire life. After her recovery was over, Bishop Ruiz asked her to join him in visiting indigenous communities throughout the various jungles of Mexico. It was through this work that she redeveloped her passion for indigenous rights and became increasingly motivated to fight for social justice. As the brutal violence continued in Guatemala, more and more indigenous fled from the country into Mexico. Rigoberta Menchu became increasingly active in the lives of these refugees and began speaking about the injustices that her people had gone through.
This is Malene, and I'll be drawing on Vargas talking about Menchu's fight for social justice. The main thing that Menchu is known for is her fight for social justice. Essentially, social justice is fairness to individuals when it comes to wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. It's all about making sure that no one is at a disadvantage because of their characteristics. Social justice is something that humans have been fighting for ever since the beginning of history. And even though a lot of progress has been made, there is still a lot that needs to be done so that we can call the world an equitable place for all. Menchu and Vargas have a lot in common, including the fact that they both wrote a book about their life experience and rough upbringing that mainly focused on social justice. In her book called I, Rigoberta Menchu, an Indian woman in Guatemala, she discussed the hard truth that she faced when she lost her loved ones to murder. In the book, she stated, quote, "From then on, I was very depressed about life because I thought, what would life be like when I grew up? I thought about my childhood and all the times that had passed. I'd often see my mother crying. I was afraid of life and I'd ask myself, what will it be like when I'm older?" End quote. This is the time where she realized that she was no longer able to live life the way it was. She had to do something for herself and for all the people in her shoes. This is Malene continuing on with Menchu's fight for social justice. Just like Vargas, Menchu was brave enough to act on her personal and public responsibility to speak up. She wasn't going to watch the world continue to mistreat people and was determined to bring justice not only to her family members who were murdered, but also to all the people that had ever faced some type of unfairness from society. Speaking up always comes with a great risk, like we can see in both Menchu's and Vargas's experience. When Vargas decided to come out to the world, or as he put it, let people in on his truth with being undocumented, he was risking everything he had. By doing this, a lot of things could have gone wrong. He could have been deported, jailed, or even lost all his chances of ever becoming a legal citizen. Instead of playing it safe, Vargas chose to stand up and do what he felt was right regarding the immigration system. This is exactly what Menchu chose to do. She put all her privileges on the line just to voice her opinion because she knew how many people this fight for justice involved. When taking a risk, discrimination is something that can always be expected. Just like Vargas, Menchu faced a lot of discrimination when she chose to join the fight for social justice. Even though Menchu didn't go on air as much as Vargas did, she still had to deal with a lot of news reporters trying to bash her name and destroy her reputation. Some people claimed that she was faking her harsh story and that she didn't deserve the recognition she got. This goes to show that bad things are often involved when doing good things, but it's important to keep going because it's ultimately what's going to make you stronger. In the end, speaking up always pays off. Both Menchu and Vargas achieved great things after voicing their opinions. Like talked about earlier, Menchu was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992 for her work with social justice. And Vargas was essentially able to push for a fix with the immigration system, ultimately having something to do with the creation of DACA as well as being nominated for many awards. After receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Menchu created an Indian advocacy organization that continues to help and support many Mayan communities. Vargas also created an organization that was intended to help others in his shoes and to continue the fight for social justice. Ultimately, Menchu is a true hero to our society. She put everything she had on the line just to bring justice to the world and fight for everyone to be equal.